England, 1815. The chandeliers of the Marchioness of Fenwood's annual gala cast a golden glow over the sea of silk gowns and tailored evening coats below. Near the refreshment table, partially concealed by an arrangement of hothouse roses, stood Miss Seraphina Chase, her 23 years sitting upon her like an ill-fitting gown as she observed the glittering assembly before her. "Have you heard?" whispered Lady Pemberton behind her fan to Mrs. Dalworth. "Miss Chase has been telling anyone who will listen that she has an understanding with the Duke of Rothesay himself. The delusion is quite remarkable." The words, though spoken in hushed tones, carried to Seraphina's ears like arrows finding their mark. She straightened her spine, smoothed the rose-colored silk of her gown, a shade she had chosen with such hope only hours earlier, and pretended not to have heard. At 23, Seraphina had believed herself beyond such casual cruelty. She had spoken only the truth when asked directly by Lady Ashford about the Duke's recent attentions. A private truth, yes, but not a lie. Never a lie. "Miss Chase," came a voice at her elbow. It was her cousin, Charlotte, her expression tight with worry. "Perhaps we might retire to the retiring room. You look rather pale." "Thank you, Charlotte, but I am quite well," she replied with a practiced smile. "I was merely observing the dancing. Lady Fenwood has outdone herself this season." Charlotte's expression flickered with concern. "Seraphina, you need not remain here. No one would think less of you if I were to flee like a guilty creature," she finished for her, a rare flash of steel entering her usually gentle voice. "No, cousin. I have spoken only truth. I will not slink away as though I have committed some sin." Before Charlotte could respond, a voice rang out across the ballroom, clear and carrying and venomous in its certainty. "There she stands." Lady Penelope Ashford's declaration cut through the music like a knife. "The little liar herself, bold as brass among her betters." A hush fell over the ballroom. Even the orchestra faltered, the violins trailing into uncertain silence. Every head turned, every eye fixed upon Seraphina, and in the sudden, terrible quiet, she heard Lady Penelope's footsteps approaching, the crowd parting before her like the Red Sea. "My beautiful family, before we see how Seraphina escapes this nightmare, I need to share something important with you. We're on a mission to reach 1,000 subscribers, and right now, there are only limited spots to be among our founding 1,000. Our inner circle who were here from the beginning. And I want you to be among our most cherished first 1,000. These first 1,000 subscribers will always hold a special place in this community. You'll be the ones who believed in these stories when we were just starting out. The ones who helped build something beautiful. But here's the thing. Once we hit that milestone, that opportunity closes forever. You'll still be welcome, but you won't be part of that exclusive founding group who shaped this channel's journey. So if you've been watching without subscribing, now is your moment. Don't let this story end without you being part of our family. And tell me where you are watching from. Now, let's get into the story. Lady Penelope Ashford was beautiful in the way a winter storm was beautiful, all sharp edges and cold brilliance. Her gown of ivory satin had cost more than Seraphina's entire wardrobe, and she wore her consequence as visibly as the diamonds at her throat. At 26, she had refused a dozen offers, waiting, it was whispered, for a duke. "Do not pretend you cannot hear me, Miss Chase," Lady Penelope said, her voice pitched to carry to every corner of the now silent ballroom. "I believe we are all owed an explanation for the falsehoods you have been spreading about His Grace, the Duke of Rothesay." Seraphina's breath caught in her throat. The faces around her swam in her vision, some avid with curiosity, others already hardening with judgment. She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. "I have spread no falsehoods," she managed at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "Speak up," Lady Penelope commanded, and the crowd pressed closer, a tightening noose of silk and judgment. "Let us all hear you. You have been claiming, have you not, that the Duke has paid you particular attention? That he has written to you? That there exists some understanding between you?" Heat flooded Serafina's face. When Lady Penelope had asked her those very questions 3 days ago in Lady Morrison's drawing room, it had seemed a simple inquiry between acquaintances. Serafina had answered honestly, if quietly. The Duke had paid her attention. He had written. There was an understanding, however new and fragile. But here, in this glittering arena, with 300 witnesses, the truth sounded like the ravings of a desperate social climber. "His Grace has been kind enough to—" "Kind?" Lady Penelope's laugh was crystalline and cruel. "How generous you are with interpretations, Miss Chase. The Duke is kind to many people. He is courteous to his inferiors, as befits his station. But you have twisted common civility into fantasy, have you not? You have manufactured a courtship from mere politeness." "I have manufactured nothing," Serafina said, but her voice trembled, and she heard how weak it sounded. "I spoke only what was true." "Then produce evidence of this truth," Lady Penelope demanded. She turned to address the assembled company, playing to her audience with practiced ease. "If the Duke of Rothesay truly held Miss Chase in the regard she claims, there would be proof, would there not? Letters, perhaps? Tokens? Witnesses to his declarations?" The crowd murmured, a susurrus of agreement that washed over Serafina like cold water. "The Duke's communications were private," Serafina said, her hands clenching in the folds of her gown. "I would not display them for public entertainment." "How convenient," Lady Penelope purred. "Private letters that no one may see. Private conversations that no one overheard. A private understanding that the Duke himself has never publicly acknowledged." She stepped closer, and Serafina caught the scent of her perfume, something French and expensive. "Tell me, Miss Chase, does the Duke even know of this understanding you claim exists? Or have you invented him as your suitor entirely within the confines of your own imagination?" "You are twisting everything," Serafina whispered. But the protest sounded hollow even to her own ears. How could she explain that Caspian had been careful, discreet, protecting both their reputations until he could speak to her father? How could she make them understand that his reserve was consideration, not indifference? "I am twisting nothing," Lady Penelope said, her voice hardening. "I am merely exposing a deception before it can do further damage. You have attempted to entrap the Duke of Rothesay with lies and presumption. You have traded on his good name to elevate your own consequence." She turned again to the crowd. How long before she claimed a betrothal? How long before her family demanded recompense for a fictional compromise? Gasps rippled through the assembly. Someone near the back said, quite clearly, "The audacity!" Serafina felt the walls closing in. Her vision narrowed to Lady Penelope's triumphant face, to the sea of condemning eyes beyond. Her tongue felt thick, useless. Every defense she might offer sounded like confirmation of guilt. "Retract your claims," Lady Penelope commanded. "Admit before all assembled that you have exaggerated the Duke's attentions beyond all reason. Admit that there is no understanding, no courtship, no particular regard. Admit that you are a liar and a social climber who sought to trap a Duke with fabrications." The silence that followed was absolute. Serafina could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 300 gazes pressing down upon her shoulders like stones. She could not move, could not speak, could not even breathe. The shame was a living thing, burning in her chest, scorching up her throat, stinging behind her eyes. To deny Lady Penelope's accusations was to sound desperate. To admit to them was to destroy herself utterly. She stood frozen, paralyzed, as Lady Penelope's smile grew wider and sharper and infinitely more cruel. Caspian Rothesay, 6th Duke of Rothesay, emerged from Lord Fenwood's study with the Earl of Harpenden's signature still drying on the contract that would see 300 acres of disputed woodland returned to the tenants who had worked it for generations. The matter had taken the better part of 2 hours to resolve. 2 hours of careful negotiation over a land dispute that had festered for decades, poisoning relations between neighboring estates and leaving families caught in legal limbo. It was precisely the sort of tedious but necessary business that his father would have ignored entirely, preferring the pleasures of the card room to the responsibilities of stewardship. Caspian had long ago determined he would not be that manner of duke. He had promised Serafina he would find her as soon as the meeting concluded. The thought of her brought a rare softening to his expression as he made his way down the corridor toward the ballroom. She would be anxious, he knew. She disliked large gatherings, found the constant scrutiny of the ton exhausting. But she had promised to attend tonight, and he had promised not to abandon her to the wolves for longer than necessary. The sound reached him before he entered the ballroom, or rather, the absence of sound. The music had stopped. The usual hum of conversation, the clink of crystal, the rustle of fabric and laughter that characterized these affairs had gone silent in a way that made the hair on the back of his neck rise. He knew that silence, had heard it before, always preceding some social catastrophe. A young lady caught in a compromising position, a gentleman accused of cheating at cards, a scandal about to detonate in the center of polite society. He quickened his pace. The butler at the ballroom entrance started to announce him, but Caspian waved him to silence and stepped through the doorway. The scene before him registered in fragments, his mind assembling the pieces with the cold precision he brought to matters of business. The crowd, packed in a tight circle near the refreshment tables. Every face turned inward toward some central spectacle. The quality of the silence, not shocked, but avid, hungry for blood. And then he saw her. Serafina stood in the center of the human arena, her face drained of color, her hands clenched in the fabric of her rose-colored gown. The gown he had mentioned admiring when they had walked in Hyde Park a week ago. The conversation that had made her blush and smile and look away with shy pleasure. She looked neither shy nor pleased now. She looked terrified. Facing her, resplendent in ivory satin and self-righteousness, stood Lady Penelope Ashford. Caspian's jaw tightened. He should have anticipated this. Should have known that Lady Penelope, having received his final and absolute rejection of her pursuit a fortnight ago, would seek to strike at him through Serafina. He had underestimated the depths of her malice, and Serafina was paying the price for his miscalculation. "Retract your claims," Lady Penelope was saying, her voice carrying clearly in the unnatural quiet. "Admit before all assembled that you have exaggerated the Duke's attentions beyond all reason. Admit that there is no understanding, no courtship, no particular regard. Admit that you are a liar and a social climber who sought to trap a duke with fabrications." White-hot rage flooded through Caspian's chest, the kind of cold fury that had made hardened men of business blanch across negotiating tables. He did not permit himself to feel such things often. Emotion was a luxury, a weakness that could be exploited. But seeing Serafina, gentle and honest and utterly unprepared for this level of calculated cruelty, standing alone against the collective judgment of the ton while he had been occupied with matters of land and law. He had failed her. And Lady Penelope had chosen her moment with vicious precision. Seraphina stood frozen, her silence damning her in the eyes of the crowd. He could see the shame washing over her in waves, could see her drowning in it, unable to defend herself because any defense would sound like the desperate pleading of the guilty. Lady Penelope's smile was triumph incarnate. And then her gaze lifted, scanning the crowd with the satisfaction of a cat who had cornered a mouse, and her eyes met his. The smile faltered. Just for an instant. Just enough for him to see the flash of calculation, the momentary uncertainty. She had not expected him, had timed this spectacle for his absence, knowing he could not defend what he had not witnessed. But he was here now. The crowd had not yet noticed his presence. They were too fixated on the tableau before them, too eager to witness Seraphina's destruction. He stood at the perimeter of the circle, still partially obscured by the press of bodies, watching Lady Penelope's mind work behind her eyes. He saw the exact moment she decided to press her advantage, to force a confession before he could intervene. "The silence is answer enough," Lady Penelope declared, raising her voice to reach the farthest corners of the ballroom. "Miss Chase cannot produce a single piece of evidence to support her fantasy because no such evidence exists. The Duke of Rothesay has never paid her particular attention. There is no understanding. There is only a sad, desperate woman who has lied to elevate herself beyond her station." A murmur rippled through the crowd, the sound of collective judgment being formed and hardened. Caspian began to move. The crowd parted before him without conscious thought, bodies shifting aside as they became aware of his presence. The murmur died, replaced by a silence even more profound than before. He heard the sharp intake of breath as someone recognized him, heard the rustle of fabric as people turned, as the realization spread like wildfire through the assembly. The Duke was here. The Duke had heard everything. Lady Penelope's face went pale beneath her rouge. Her eyes widened, her triumphant smile freezing into something brittle and desperate. She had gambled that he would not arrive in time, and she had lost. Seraphina's gaze found his, and he saw the flash of hope in her eyes, quickly suppressed, as though she feared even that small flicker would be crushed. She thought him angry, perhaps. Thought he might add his condemnation to Lady Penelope's, might publicly deny their understanding, to protect his own reputation. She did not yet know him as well as she would. He walked forward with measured, deliberate steps, his expression carved from granite, his eyes fixed not on Seraphina, but on Lady Penelope Ashford. The crowd held its collective breath. When he reached the center of the circle, he stopped. The silence was absolute, every person in the ballroom frozen in anticipation of his next words. He did not speak. Not yet. He simply stood beside Seraphina, close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed hers, and waited for Lady Penelope to understand the full magnitude of her miscalculation. 6 days earlier, Seraphina had stood in the morning room of her family's modest townhouse in Bloomsbury, watching rain streak down the window panes, when the butler had announced a visitor that made her heart perform an altogether undignified leap. His Grace, the Duke of Rothesay. She had turned from the window, acutely aware of the plainness of the room compared to the grandeur he must be accustomed to. The furniture was genteel but worn, the carpet faded in patches where sunlight had touched it over the years. Her family was respectable, certainly. Her father a younger son of good lineage who had made a modest fortune in trade. But they were not ducal. Not even close. Caspian had entered the room as though it were a palace, removing his hat and gloves with the same careful precision he brought to all things. He had visited 3 times before, always properly chaperoned, always observing the strictest proprieties. But this morning, her mother had been out paying calls, and only her elderly aunt dozed in the corner, her embroidery abandoned in her lap. "Your Grace," Serafina had said, curtsying, "this is unexpected." "Forgive the intrusion, Miss Chase." His voice was low, careful. "I find myself in need of counsel, and I have come to trust your discretion above all others." The words had warmed her, even as they puzzled her. They had known each other only a matter of weeks, a chance meeting at a musicale, a deliberate encounter at a gallery, those 3 subsequent visits. Surely he had advisors, men of experience and wisdom, to whom he might turn for counsel. "I am honored by your confidence," she had said, gesturing to the settee, "though I cannot imagine what counsel I might provide that would be of use to a duke." He had not sat. Instead, he had moved to stand near the window, looking out at the rain-soaked street, his profile sharp against the gray light. For a long moment, he had said nothing, and she had watched the tension in his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw that suggested some inner struggle. "There is a matter concerning my estate," he said at last. "A land dispute that has persisted for nearly 30 years. 300 acres of woodland on the border between my lands and those of the Earl of Harpenden. The tenants who have worked that land, good families, hard-working people, have been caught in legal limbo. They cannot improve their cottages, cannot invest in their futures, because no one knows who truly owns the soil beneath their feet." Serafina had moved closer, drawn by the passion in his voice. This was not the remote, composed duke that society saw. This was a man who cared deeply about people most of his station would never consider. "My father refused to settle the matter," Caspian continued, bitterness creeping into his tone. "He found the whole business tedious. Thought it beneath his notice whether tenant families prospered or starved. When I inherited, I discovered documents, evidence that the land had been improperly seized during my grandfather's time. The moral claim belongs to Harpenden's estate, but the legal claim is murky enough that I could fight it in chancery for another generation." "But you do not wish to," Serafina said softly. He turned to face her then, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath catch. "I wish to do what is right. I wish to return the land to its proper stewardship and see those families freed from uncertainty. But Harpenden is proud. If I approach this as a concession, as an admission of my family's wrongdoing, he will refuse out of sheer stubborn pride. The matter will end up in courts, and the tenants will suffer for another decade while solicitors grow fat on fees." "Then how do you propose to resolve it?" she asked. "With a fiction," he said, and for the first time, she saw something like a smile touch his mouth. Or perhaps a careful reframing of truth. "I intend to propose a trade, my woodland for a tract of fenland on Harpenden's northern border that has been troublesome for him. I will present it as a mutually beneficial exchange, a matter of practical estate management." He saves face. The tenants receive clear title. Justice is served, albeit quietly. Serafina had understood immediately. But if word spreads of the true nature of the exchange, if it becomes known that you are conceding land that was improperly taken, then I appear weak, Caspian finished. Other neighbors with long-standing disputes will see it as an invitation to challenge my holdings. My own stewards will question my judgment. The very tenants I seek to help might lose faith in my ability to protect them. He stepped closer. close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the weariness that came from bearing responsibility alone. I am telling you this, Miss Chase, because I find that I cannot carry every secret alone, and because I hope. He paused, something vulnerable flickering across his features. I hope that you might be someone with whom I can share such burdens in the future. The implication had stolen her breath. A future. He was speaking of a future. The agreement will be signed at the Fenwood Gala, he had continued, his voice dropping lower. I have arranged to meet with Harpenden in Lord Fenwood's study before the dancing begins. Once the documents are executed, the matter will be settled. But until then, absolute discretion is essential. Harpenden has agreed only because he believes he is gaining advantage, not granting me a favor. I understand, Serafina had said, though her heart was racing. You may trust my silence, Your Grace. Caspian, he had corrected gently. When we are private, I would have you call me Caspian. The intimacy of it had made her dizzy. Then you must call me Serafina. He had taken her hand then, a liberty that should have shocked her, but instead felt perfectly natural. His thumb had brushed across her knuckles, the touch feather-light but deliberate. There is more I must tell you. Lady Penelope Ashford has been making inquiries into my affairs. She called upon my steward last week, attempting to extract information about my business dealings. I suspect she hopes to find some leverage, some knowledge she might use to... He had stopped, a muscle tightening in his jaw. To secure your attention, Serafina had finished quietly. She will not succeed, he had said, his voice hard. But I fear she may attempt to strike at me through those He paused, choosing his words carefully. Through those I hold in regard. If she approaches you, if she asks questions about my affairs or about the nature of our acquaintance, I beg you to tell her nothing. She is not above using partial truths to construct damaging fictions. Serafina had nodded, understanding the warning even as a cold finger of fear traced down her spine. I will be careful. But then, 3 days later, in Lady Morrison's drawing room, when Lady Penelope had approached with such apparent friendliness, asking such seemingly innocent questions about the Duke's visits, Serafina had not recognized the trap until it was too late. Has the Duke mentioned his business dealings to you? Lady Penelope had asked, her tone light and conversational. I understand he is quite progressive in his management of his estates. Does he discuss such matters with you? And Serafina, flattered to be asked, wanting to demonstrate that Caspian valued her mind as well as her company, had said, He has been kind enough to seek my counsel on certain matters, yes. Lady Penelope's eyes had sharpened. How extraordinary. On what sort of matters, if I may ask? Too late, Serafina had remembered Caspian's warning. That is a private concern. Of course, Lady Penelope had said smoothly. But surely if there were a true understanding between you, he would have made it known publicly? Or has he asked you to keep his attention secret as well? The question had been a masterwork of subtle poison. To deny an understanding was to diminish what was growing between them. To confirm it was to invite exactly the sort of scrutiny Caspian had warned against. Serafina had stammered something non-committal and fled at the first opportunity, her cheeks burning with the certainty that she had made a terrible mistake. She had not imagined that Lady Penelope would take those few awkward admissions and transform them into a public accusation of fabrication and social climbing. Now, standing in the Marchioness of Fenwood's ballroom with 300 pairs of eyes upon her, Serafina understood with perfect, terrible clarity that she had been outmaneuvered by someone who understood the rules of society far better than she ever would. The moment Caspian took his position beside Serafina, Lady Penelope's expression shifted from triumph to calculation. She had lost the element of surprise, but she had not lost her audience. The entire ballroom remained transfixed, waiting to see how this drama would resolve itself. "Your Grace," Lady Penelope said, her voice honey-sweet as she executed a flawless curtsy. "How fortuitous that you have arrived. Perhaps you might assist us in clearing up a small matter of confusion." Caspian said nothing. His silence was deliberate, absolute, and far more unnerving than any words might have been. Serafina could feel the tension radiating from him, could sense the cold fury beneath his composed exterior. Lady Penelope's smile tightened, but she pressed forward. "Miss Chase has been making certain claims about the nature of your acquaintance. Claims which, I am certain, have been misunderstood or perhaps exaggerated in the retelling. You know how these things can grow beyond all proportion." "What claims?" Caspian's voice was quiet, but it carried through the silent ballroom like the crack of a whip. "Why, that you have paid her particular attention," Lady Penelope said, her tone suggesting the very idea was absurd. "That you have written to her. That there exists some manner of understanding between you." She paused, allowing the crowd to absorb the implications. "I have been attempting to give Miss Chase the opportunity to clarify these misunderstandings before they damage her reputation irreparably." "How generous of you," Caspian said, each word edged with ice. Lady Penelope's cheeks flushed, but she recovered quickly. "I act only out of concern for Miss Chase's welfare. Surely you can see how dangerous it is for a young woman to allow such fantasies to take root. Why, only 3 days ago, she told several ladies in Lady Morrison's drawing room that you had sought her counsel on matters of business, that you had entrusted her with confidential information regarding your estates." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Serafina felt her stomach drop. Lady Penelope had twisted everything, made it sound grasping and presumptuous rather than the private confidence it had been. "She claimed," Lady Penelope continued, warming to her subject, "that you valued her opinion above that of your own advisers, that you came to her townhouse in Bloomsbury to discuss matters you could not entrust to men of experience and position." She turned to address the assembled nobility. "Is it not clear what has happened here? Miss Chase, flattered by common courtesy, has constructed an entire courtship from a few polite exchanges. Perhaps the Duke visited her family once, as any gentleman might when making casual acquaintance. But she has transformed that simple civility into evidence of devoted attachment." "That is not," Serafina began, but her voice came out thin and desperate. "I never claimed." "Did you not tell Lady Morrison that the Duke had visited you?" Lady Penelope interrupted, her voice sharp. "Yes, but... And did you not say that he had discussed confidential business matters with you?" "He did, but that was... And did you not imply that there was an understanding between you?" "I said no such thing." Serafina's voice rose, touched with panic now. "You asked me directly if the Duke had paid me particular attention, and I answered honestly. I never claimed." "Honesty?" Lady Penelope's laugh was crystalline and cruel. "Is it honest to allow people to believe you have secured the regard of a duke when no such regard exists? Is it honest to hint at confidences and understandings that are nothing more than the product of your own desperate imagination?" "I have not imagined anything," Serafina said. But she could hear how weak it sounded. Every defense she attempted only seemed to confirm Lady Penelope's accusations. She looked to Caspian, hoping for some sign, some indication that he would speak on her behalf. but his face remained impassive, his attention fixed on Lady Penelope with the intensity of a predator watching prey. "Perhaps Miss Chase has merely misunderstood the Duke's intentions," said Lady Pemberton from the crowd, her tone suggesting sympathy that was anything but. "She is quite young, after all, inexperienced in the ways of society." "Indeed," agreed Mrs. Dalworth. "It is a common enough mistake for a girl of limited sophistication to mistake a duke's courtesy for romantic interest." "I am 23, Seraphina said, her voice barely audible. "I am not a child who cannot distinguish courtesy from—" "Then what explanation can you offer?" Lady Penelope demanded. "If you are not confused and you are not lying, then surely you can provide evidence of this understanding you claim exists. A letter, perhaps? Something written in the Duke's own hand that demonstrates his particular regard?" The trap closed with perfect precision. If Seraphina produced Caspian's letter, the one he had sent 2 days after their conversation, thanking her for her discretion and expressing his hope that they might continue their acquaintance, she would be exposing the very confidential matter he had entrusted to her. She would be proving Lady Penelope's insinuation that she could not be trusted with sensitive information. But if she refused to produce evidence, she would appear to be exactly what Lady Penelope claimed: a liar who had fabricated the entire relationship. "The Duke's correspondence is private," Seraphina managed. "I would not display it for public entertainment." "How convenient," Lady Penelope said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Private letters that cannot be shown. Private conversations that cannot be verified. Private understandings that exist only in your own mind." She turned to face the crowd fully now, playing to her audience with practiced skill. "I ask you all, does this not have the ring of falsehood? If the Duke of Rothesay truly held Miss Chase in the regard she claims, would he not have made his intentions known? Would he not have called upon her father? Would he not have demonstrated his attachment in ways that society could recognize and approve?" "Hear, hear," someone murmured from the back of the crowd. "She makes a fair point," said another voice. Seraphina felt the tide turning against her, felt the collective judgment of the ton hardening like cement. They wanted to believe Lady Penelope. It was easier, more comfortable to believe that an insignificant girl from Bloomsbury had overreached than to accept that a duke might genuinely value someone outside their glittering circle. "I have told no lies," Seraphina said. But her voice shook now, tears threatening to spill despite her desperate attempts to maintain composure. "Every word I spoke was true. I cannot, I will not, betray a confidence to satisfy public curiosity. But I have not lied." "Then you leave us no choice but to conclude that you have indeed fabricated this entire affair," Lady Penelope said with an air of finality. "Unless, of course, the Duke himself wishes to confirm your claims." She turned to Caspian with an expression of calculated innocence. "Your Grace, perhaps you might settle this matter definitively. Have you paid Miss Chase particular attention? Have you sought her counsel on matters of business? Is there an understanding between you?" The ballroom held its collective breath, every eye fixed on the Duke of Rothesay, and Seraphina standing beside him with her heart breaking and her reputation in tatters, waited for him to speak the words that would either save her or destroy her utterly. Caspian's face remained carved from granite, his expression utterly unreadable as Lady Penelope's question hung in the air between them. The silence stretched, seconds becoming an eternity, and still he said nothing. Seraphina felt something cold and terrible unfurl in her chest. He was not speaking. The man who had sat in her modest morning room and spoken of trust, of shared burdens, of a future, that man had disappeared, replaced by this remote duke whose gray eyes revealed nothing, whose silence felt like a verdict. She had been so certain, so foolishly, desperately certain that what had passed between them was real. But standing here now, watching him weigh his response with the careful calculation of a man protecting his interests, she felt the foundations of that certainty crumble beneath her. Perhaps she had misunderstood. Perhaps his visits had been mere courtesy after all, his confidences nothing more than the idle musings of a man who thought aloud to anyone convenient. Perhaps she had been exactly what Lady Penelope claimed, a foolish girl who had mistaken a duke's momentary attention for something deeper, something lasting. The thought made her feel physically ill. "Your Grace?" Lady Penelope prompted, her voice touched with false concern. Surely this is a simple enough question to answer. Either you have paid Miss Chase particular attention, or you have not. Caspian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but still he remained silent. His gaze had shifted from Lady Penelope to some point in the middle distance, as though he were working through a complicated equation, weighing variables and outcomes with the same dispassionate precision he likely brought to matters of estate management and parliamentary business. He was deciding, Serafina realized with dawning horror. Deciding whether acknowledging their acquaintance was worth the complications it would bring. Deciding whether she was worth the scandal that Lady Penelope had so carefully constructed. "I understand this must be awkward for you, Your Grace," Lady Penelope continued, her tone softening into something approximating sympathy. "Miss Chase has placed you in an impossible position. If you deny her claims, you appear cruel. If you acknowledge them, you validate her presumption. But surely the truth must be spoken, for her sake as much as yours." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Lady Pemberton nodded sagely. Mrs. Dalworth whispered something to her companion behind her fan. Serafina could not breathe. The ballroom felt airless, suffocating. She was acutely aware of every eye upon her, every whispered speculation, every judgment being formed and hardened in the silence of Caspian's non-response. She should leave. Should gather what remained of her dignity and simply walk away before he was forced to speak the words that would confirm her humiliation. It would be kinder that way, perhaps. A quiet retreat rather than a public execution. But her feet would not move. Some stubborn, self-destructive part of her needed to hear him say it, needed to hear him deny what had passed between them, so that she could finally stop hoping. Stop believing in something that had apparently existed only in her own imagination. Caspian's gaze shifted then, meeting hers for the first time since Lady Penelope had posed her question. For a brief, terrible moment, their eyes locked, and Serafina searched his face desperately for some sign of the man who had stood in her morning room and spoken of burdens shared and futures imagined. She found nothing. His expression remained shuttered, distant, as though he were looking at a stranger rather than the woman to whom he had entrusted his secrets only days before. The cold thing in her chest expanded, pressing against her ribs, making each breath a conscious effort. He was going to abandon her. She could see it in the calculation behind his eyes, in the careful way he was choosing his moment to speak. He was a duke, and dukes did not allow themselves to be dragged into scandal by insignificant girls from Bloomsbury who could not navigate the treacherous waters of ton politics without drowning. "Your Grace," Lady Penelope said again, her voice taking on an edge of impatience now. "We are all waiting." "I am aware," Caspian said quietly, his first words since the interrogation began. The sound of his voice, cool, measured, utterly devoid of emotion, struck Serafina like a physical blow. This was not the voice that had spoken to her of justice and duty. and the weight of doing what was right, even when it was difficult. This was the voice of a man protecting his position, his reputation, his carefully constructed life from the chaos of an inconvenient attachment. She had been a fool, a complete and utter fool. "I apologize for the delay," Caspian continued, still not looking at Serafina. "I was considering how best to address a situation that has been deliberately engineered to cause maximum damage, regardless of how I respond." There was something in the way he said "deliberately engineered" that made Lady Penelope stiffen slightly, but she recovered quickly. "I assure you, Your Grace, I seek only clarity. Miss Chase's claims have caused considerable confusion, and I thought it best to resolve the matter publicly rather than allow rumors to fester." "How thoughtful of you," Caspian said, and there was a quality to his voice that Serafina could not quite identify. It was not warmth, precisely, but neither was it the cold dismissal she had been bracing herself to hear. She felt a flicker of something that might have been hope, but she crushed it ruthlessly. Hope had led her into this disaster. Hope had made her believe that a duke might genuinely care for a woman of no particular consequence. Hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. "I will answer your question, Lady Penelope," Caspian said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. "But first, I have a question of my own." Lady Penelope's eyes narrowed slightly. "Of course, Your Grace." "You have accused Miss Chase of fabricating claims about the nature of our acquaintance," Caspian said slowly, each word chosen with the precision of a surgeon selecting an instrument. "You have demanded evidence of my regard. You have questioned her honesty before the assembled nobility of London." He paused, and something shifted in his expression. Something sharp and dangerous that made several people in the crowd take an unconscious step backward. "Tell me, Lady Penelope, what evidence do you possess that Miss Chase has lied?" The question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of uncertainty through the crowd. Lady Penelope's mouth opened, then closed. The absence of evidence is itself evidence, Your Grace. She cannot produce—" "That is not what I asked," Caspian interrupted, his voice hardening. "You have not accused Miss Chase of failing to prove her claims. You have accused her of lying, of fabrication, of social climbing through deliberate deception. Those are serious charges, Lady Penelope. Charges that, if proven false, constitute slander of the most vicious sort." The temperature in the ballroom seemed to drop by several degrees. Serafina stared at Caspian, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was not defending her, not exactly. But neither was he abandoning her. He was doing something else entirely, something she did not yet understand. "I merely sought to protect you from—" Lady Penelope began, but Caspian cut her off with a single raised hand. "Answer the question," he said quietly. "What evidence do you possess that Miss Chase has lied?" Lady Penelope's composure, which had wavered for just a moment under Caspian's sharp questioning, reasserted itself with the practiced ease of a woman accustomed to social combat. She drew herself up, her diamonds catching the candlelight, and met his gaze with an expression of wounded innocence. "Your Grace, I possess the same evidence as everyone else in this ballroom," she said, her voice pitched to sound reasonable, even sympathetic. "Which is to say, no evidence at all. That is precisely my point." She turned to address the crowd, including them in her argument, as a lawyer might appeal to a jury. "Miss Chase claims you have paid her particular attention. She claims you have entrusted her with confidential matters. She claims there exists an understanding between you. Yet when asked to provide proof of these extraordinary claims, she can offer nothing. Perhaps because such matters are private, Caspian said, his tone dangerously soft. Private, yes, Lady Penelope agreed readily. But not invisible. A courtship, even a discreet one, leaves traces, letters, tokens, witnesses to conversations or meetings. Formal calls witnessed by family members. Some evidence of intent beyond one woman's word. She paused, allowing the logic of her argument to settle over the assembly. If what Miss Chase claims were true, there would be proof. The very absence of such proof suggests that her claims are, at best, exaggerations of casual civility. Serafina felt the crowd shifting again, swaying back toward Lady Penelope's interpretation. It was masterfully done. By focusing on the absence of evidence rather than on any positive proof of falsehood, Lady Penelope had placed the burden entirely on Serafina's shoulders while appearing to take the reasonable, rational position. Miss Chase has already stated that she will not display private correspondence for public entertainment, Caspian said. But there was something in his voice, a note of warning perhaps, or calculation, that made Serafina's breath catch. How convenient, Lady Penelope said, echoing her earlier accusation. Private correspondence that cannot be shown. Private understandings that cannot be verified. Surely you see the problem, Your Grace. Without evidence, we have only Miss Chase's word that any of this is real. And given the extraordinary nature of her claims, that a duke of the realm would pursue a woman of her modest station and circumstances, forgive me. But her word alone is simply not sufficient. The cruelty of it was surgical. Lady Penelope had not directly insulted Serafina's family or breeding, but the implication hung in the air nonetheless. Girls like Serafina did not attract dukes, and anyone who claimed otherwise was either delusional or duplicitous. What would you consider sufficient evidence? Caspian asked, his voice still carrying that dangerous softness that made Serafina think of ice cracking over deep water. Lady Penelope smiled, sensing victory within her grasp. Why, written proof would be ideal. A letter in your hand, Your Grace, that demonstrates the particular regard Miss Chase claims you hold for her. Or perhaps a witness. Someone of unimpeachable character who could testify to having seen evidence of this courtship with their own eyes. She paused, letting the impossibility of such evidence sink in. But as we all know, no such evidence exists. Because there is no courtship. There is only a young woman's fantasy and her unfortunate willingness to speak that fantasy aloud, as though it were fact. You seem very certain, Caspian observed. I am certain, Lady Penelope declared, her confidence absolute now. She turned to face Serafina directly, her expression hardening into something triumphant and cruel. Miss Chase, I challenge you publicly, before all assembled. If you have told the truth, if the Duke has indeed paid you particular attention, if he has indeed discussed confidential matters with you, if there is indeed an understanding between you, then produce evidence. Show us a letter. Name a witness. Provide anything at all that might substantiate your extraordinary claims. The ballroom was utterly silent, every eye fixed on Serafina, waiting. And if I do not? Serafina asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice despite the terror coursing through her veins. Then you will admit, here and now, before God and this entire company, that you have lied, Lady Penelope said. You will acknowledge that you fabricated or exaggerated the Duke's interest to elevate your own consequence. You will apologize to His Grace for placing him in this intolerable position. And you will withdraw from society until such time as you have learned the value of truth and the danger of presumption. It was a death sentence, socially speaking. To make such an admission would destroy Serafina's reputation utterly and irrevocably. She would be known forever as the girl who had tried to trap a duke with lies. Her family would be tainted by association. Her sister's prospects would be damaged. She would become a cautionary tale, whispered about in drawing rooms for generations. "That is quite an ultimatum," Caspian said. But he was not looking at Lady Penelope. He was looking at Serafina. And there was something in his gaze now. Something sharp and assessing that made her wonder if this entire exchange had been leading to precisely this moment. "It is fair," Lady Penelope countered. "The truth should be simple to prove. If truth it is, the fact that Miss Chase hesitates tells us everything we need to know." "I do not hesitate because I have lied," Serafina said, finding her voice at last. "I hesitate because the Duke entrusted me with confidential information. To produce evidence of his confidence would be to betray that trust." "How noble you make yourself sound," Lady Penelope said with a harsh laugh. "But let us be honest about what is truly happening here. You cannot produce evidence because no evidence exists. You have painted yourself into a corner with your lies, and now you hide behind claims of confidentiality to avoid exposure. That is not—" "Then prove me wrong," Lady Penelope interrupted, her voice rising with the fervor of someone certain of victory. "Produce a letter. Name a witness. Show us anything at all that demonstrates the Duke's regard. Or admit that you have lied and beg his forgiveness for the embarrassment you have caused him." The challenge hung in the air like a blade suspended over Serafina's head. She looked at Caspian, desperate for some sign, some indication of what he wanted her to do. His expression remained unreadable, but she thought she saw something in his eyes. A flash of something that might have been encouragement or warning, or both. "I will not betray the Duke's confidence," Serafina said quietly, her decision made. "No matter the cost to myself." Lady Penelope's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Then you have condemned yourself with your own words. Without evidence, we can only conclude that there is nothing to hide, because there is nothing to reveal. You have lied, Miss Chase, and now you will face the consequences of that lie." The crowd murmured its agreement, the sound building like distant thunder. Serafina stood frozen, watching her reputation crumble around her, knowing that in choosing to protect Caspian's secret, she had sacrificed everything else. Her hands trembled despite her best efforts to remain composed. The shame and fear she had been holding at bay crashed over her in waves. But she had made her choice. Whatever happened next, she would not betray the trust he had placed in her, even if it meant her complete and total ruin. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. The ballroom remained suspended in that awful silence. 300 souls holding their collective breath, waiting for the final blow to fall. Then Caspian moved. The crowd had already parted to allow him into the center of the confrontation. But now he stepped forward with such deliberate, measured purpose that those nearest actually took an additional step back, as though his presence carried a physical force that demanded distance. He did not look at Serafina as he moved. His attention remained fixed on Lady Penelope with the intensity of a man who had identified his target and was moving to neutralize it with surgical precision. Serafina's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, then. The moment when he would distance himself from the scandal she had inadvertently created. The moment when he would protect his name and his position by delivering the denial that everyone expected, that Lady Penelope had so carefully orchestrated, that would seal Serafina's fate as a liar and a social climber. She wanted to close her eyes, to block out the sight of her own destruction. But some perverse instinct kept them open. If she was to be ruined, she would at least witness it with clear vision. She owed herself that much dignity. The rustle of Caspian's evening coat was the only sound in the vast ballroom as he came to a stop directly before Lady Penelope. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to maintain eye contact, a physical dynamic that subtly undermined her air of command. "Lady Penelope," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silence. "You have made a series of accusations this evening. You have impugned the character of Miss Seraphina Chase before the assembled nobility of London. You have demanded evidence, issued ultimatums, and proclaimed yourself the arbiter of truth and falsehood." Lady Penelope's chin lifted. "I have merely sought to protect you, Your Grace, from—" "I did not ask you to speak," Caspian said quietly, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "I am speaking now. You will listen." It was not a request. The Duke of Rothesay, 6th of his name, master of estates spanning 3 counties, a man whose word carried weight in Parliament and whose displeasure could destroy careers, had just given an order. And the entire ballroom understood that disobedience would carry consequences. Lady Penelope's mouth snapped shut, 2 spots of color appearing high on her cheekbones. But she said nothing. Caspian turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the assembled company. Lords and ladies, politicians and social arbiters, the cream of English society, all of them watching, waiting, ready to bear witness to whatever pronouncement he was about to make. "You came here expecting a denial," Caspian said, addressing the crowd now rather than Lady Penelope. "You came expecting me to distance myself from Miss Chase, to protect my reputation at the expense of hers. You came expecting me to allow her to be sacrificed on the altar of social propriety, while I emerged unscathed." The silence that followed was absolute. Not a fan moved. Not a breath was taken loudly enough to disturb the stillness. "And I suspect," Caspian continued, his voice taking on an edge that could have cut diamond, "that some of you are rather looking forward to it. There is a peculiar entertainment in watching someone be destroyed, particularly when that someone has committed the sin of aspiring above her station." Several people in the crowd had the grace to look uncomfortable. Lady Pemberton suddenly found her fan fascinating. Mrs. Dalworth studied the floor with intense concentration. Caspian's gaze settled on Lady Penelope once more. "You asked for evidence of my regard for Miss Chase. You demanded proof of our acquaintance. You challenged her to produce letters or name witnesses, knowing full well that a woman of honor would not display private correspondence or betray confidences for public consumption. Your Grace, I only sought silence." The word cracked like a whip. Lady Penelope actually flinched. "You have had your opportunity to speak. You have used that opportunity to slander an innocent woman. Now you will listen while I address the consequences of that choice." He reached into his coat, and the entire ballroom seemed to lean forward unconsciously, straining to see what he was retrieving. Even Seraphina found herself holding her breath, her mind racing through possibilities, unable to comprehend what was happening. This was not the denial she had been expecting. This was something else entirely, something she did not yet understand. Caspian's hand emerged from his coat holding a folded letter. The paper cream-colored and sealed with what appeared to be his family crest in dark blue wax. He held it up so that the crowd could see it clearly, the candlelight from the chandeliers making the wax seal glitter. "You demanded evidence," Caspian said, his voice cutting through the silent ballroom like a blade. "Very well. I shall provide it." Seraphina's breath caught in her throat. What was he doing? The letter about the land dispute was private, confidential. If he revealed its contents, it would expose exactly the sort of weakness he had warned her about. the sort of vulnerability that could invite challenges to his authority. Unless, her mind raced, unless he had anticipated this, unless he had known, somehow, that Lady Penelope would make this exact move in this exact way, and he had prepared for it. But how could he have known? She had told no one about Lady Penelope's questions in Lady Morrison's drawing room. She had not even seen him since that afternoon 3 days ago. Caspian's eyes met hers for the first time since he had stepped forward, and in that brief glance, she saw something that made her heart stutter in her chest. Not anger, not regret, but something that looked almost like an apology, though for what, she could not fathom. Then he turned back to face the crowd, the letter held between his fingers like a weapon about to be deployed. Lady Penelope has declared that if Miss Chase were telling the truth, there would be written evidence of my regard, he said. She has challenged Miss Chase to produce such evidence, knowing that a woman of discretion would not do so. He paused, and a small, cold smile touched his lips. Fortunately, I labor under no such constraint. The ballroom erupted in a collective gasp, and Caspian, Duke of Rothesay, broke the seal on the letter and prepared to read its contents to 300 witnesses who would carry the tale to every corner of London society before the night was through. The letter unfolded in Caspian's hands with a whisper of fine paper, the sound somehow carrying through the absolute silence of the ballroom. Seraphina watched his long fingers smooth the creases, watched the candlelight illuminate the close-written lines of text, and felt time itself slow to a crawl. This was the letter, the one he had sent her 2 days after their conversation in her morning room, the one she had read and reread until she could recite portions of it from memory, the letter that thanked her for her discretion, that explained in careful detail the resolution he hoped to achieve with the Earl of Harpenden, that concluded with words so tender they had made her heart ache with the impossibility of what was growing between them. He was going to read it aloud, before 300 witnesses, before Lady Penelope and all her malicious allies, before every gossip and social arbiter in London. The private would become public, the confidential would become currency. Everything he had warned her against, everything he had sought to protect through discretion and careful strategy, he was about to sacrifice it all. For her. The realization struck her with such force that she actually swayed on her feet. Charlotte's hand appeared at her elbow, steadying her, but Seraphina barely registered the touch, all her attention fixed on Caspian as he lifted the letter and began to read. "My dear Miss Chase," he began, his voice carrying through the ballroom with perfect clarity. The formal address, the proper distance of it, seemed to reassure some members of the crowd that this would be nothing more than polite correspondence between casual acquaintances. They were wrong. "I write to express my gratitude for the counsel you provided during my visit of the 14th instant," Caspian continued. "Your discretion in the matter we discussed is appreciated beyond measure, and your insight regarding the resolution of the Harpenden dispute proved invaluable." A murmur rippled through the assembly. The Harpenden dispute was known to anyone who followed matters of land and title, a decades-old tangle of claims and counterclaims that had enriched solicitors and impoverished tenants for a generation. That the Duke had discussed such matters with an unmarried woman of no particular political connection was irregular enough to raise eyebrows. But Caspian was not finished. "You asked, when I confided in you, why I would entrust such sensitive information to someone I had known for so brief a time," he read. And now his voice took on a quality that made several ladies in the crowd press gloved hands to their hearts. "I shall attempt to answer that question now, though words seem insufficient to the task." He paused, his eyes lifting from the page to sweep across the assembled nobility. When he spoke again, every word landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock through the crowd. I have found in you a quality that is rare in my experience, a mind that prizes justice above advantage, truth above expedience. In our conversations, brief though they have been, I have discovered a companion whose judgment I trust more than that of counselors who have served my family for decades. Lady Penelope's face had gone pale beneath her rouge, but Caspian did not even glance in her direction. His attention remained fixed on the letter, on the words he was delivering like a prosecutor presenting evidence at trial. The matter of the Harpenden woodland is resolved, thanks in no small part to your suggestion that I frame the negotiation as mutual benefit rather than concession, he continued. The agreement was signed this very evening. 300 acres will be returned to proper stewardship, and 30 tenant families will receive clear title to land they have worked for generations. This outcome, this justice, exists because you possess the wisdom to see a path I could not find alone. Serafina felt tears prick at her eyes. She had not known, had not realized that her half-formed suggestion, offered hesitantly over tea in her modest morning room, had actually shaped his approach to the negotiation. She had thought herself merely a sounding board, a sympathetic ear for a man who carried too many burdens alone. But he had listened, had valued her counsel, had trusted her with matters that men of power typically guarded jealously among themselves. You asked if I considered you merely convenient, Caspian read, and now his voice dropped lower, became something intimate despite the hundreds of witnesses. I shall be plain. I consider you essential. In a world of careful maneuvers and calculated alliances, you are refreshingly, devastatingly honest. In a society that prizes performance over principle, you choose integrity even when it costs you dearly. He looked up from the letter then, and his gaze found Serafina's across the crowded ballroom. What she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. Not the remote calculation of a duke protecting his interests, but something raw and real that no amount of social training could disguise. I am writing to you not merely to express gratitude, he read. Though he no longer looked at the page, the words apparently committed to memory, but to request permission to call upon your father at his earliest convenience. There are matters of a personal nature that I wish to discuss with him, matters that concern your future happiness and mine. The ballroom erupted in gasps and exclamations. The careful silence shattering like crystal dropped on marble. Ladies clutched at their companions' arms. Gentlemen exchanged wide-eyed glances. Lady Pemberton's fan actually slipped from her nerveless fingers to clatter on the floor. But Caspian's voice rose above the chaos, reading the final lines with perfect, deliberate clarity. Until such time as I may properly express the depth of my regard, I remain, as ever, devoted to your service and hopeful for your favor. I am, Miss Chase, most sincerely and ardently yours, Rothsay. The last word fell into sudden, profound silence. Caspian lowered the letter, refolded it with careful precision, and returned it to his coat. Then he turned to face Lady Penelope Ashford, who stood frozen like a statue carved from ice and malice and thwarted ambition. You demanded evidence of my regard for Miss Chase, he said, his voice soft but carrying a weight that made grown men flinch. You challenged her to prove that I had entrusted her with confidential matters. You accused her of fabricating our acquaintance, of lying about the nature of our understanding. He took a step toward Lady Penelope, and she actually retreated, her earlier confidence crumbling like sand beneath a wave. I have provided your evidence, Caspian continued, each word precise and cutting. A letter written in my own hand, dated 4 days past, detailing exactly the confidence and regard Miss Chase described. Every claim you called a lie has been proven truth. Every accusation you leveled has been revealed as slander." Lady Penelope's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. The triumphant social arbiter who had commanded the ballroom minutes before had been reduced to a speechless, defeated woman whose malice had been publicly exposed. "Miss Chase protected my confidence at great cost to herself," Caspian said, turning now to address the entire assembly. When challenged to produce evidence, she refused, not because such evidence did not exist, but because she valued my trust above her own reputation. She chose honor over expedience, integrity over self-preservation. He looked back at Serafina, and the warmth in his expression made her heart stutter. She is, in short, everything I could hope for in a partner. Everything I never dared believe I might find. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. One moment Serafina stood isolated in the center of a hostile crowd. The next, she found herself surrounded by a sea of suddenly sympathetic faces, each more eager than the last to demonstrate their support for the woman they had been condemning mere minutes before. "My dear Miss Chase," Lady Pemberton gushed, materializing at Serafina's elbow with the same fan she had wielded so effectively in spreading earlier gossip. "I hope you understand that we were merely concerned for your welfare. These matters can be so easily misconstrued." "Indeed," Mrs. Dalworth agreed, pressing forward with a smile that revealed too many teeth. "One cannot be too careful with one's reputation. We were simply attempting to protect you from misunderstanding." Serafina stared at them, unable to summon a response to such breathtaking duplicity. These were the same women who had whispered behind their fans about her delusions, who had nodded sagely when Lady Penelope accused her of social climbing and fabrication. Now they smiled and cooed as though they had been her champions all along. "You showed remarkable composure," said the Marchioness of Fenwood herself, sweeping forward in a rustle of emerald silk. "To maintain such dignity under such provocation, it speaks to excellent breeding and strength of character." The irony was not lost on Serafina. An hour ago, these same people had been prepared to see her ruined, had been actively enjoying the spectacle of her destruction. But a duke had spoken, had publicly claimed her as his intended. And now the entire ton rearranged itself like iron filings drawn to a magnet, aligning their opinions with power as they always did. Charlotte remained at her side, her hand a steady presence on Serafina's arm. But even her cousin seemed overwhelmed by the sudden onslaught of attention. Lords who had never acknowledged their existence now bowed with elaborate courtesy. Ladies who had barely tolerated their presence at social gatherings now pressed invitations upon them with desperate enthusiasm. "You must come to my card party next week," Lady Morrison insisted, the same woman in whose drawing room Lady Penelope had first laid her trap. "I shall brook no refusal, my dear. We have such a delightful circle, and I know everyone would be enchanted by your company." The shamelessness of it made Serafina's head spin. But beneath the dizzying rush of social rehabilitation, she was acutely aware of another shift taking place in the ballroom. The tide that had turned so decisively in her favor had turned with equal force against Lady Penelope. "I cannot believe she would make such accusations without foundation," someone said loudly enough to be clearly overheard. "The malice required to orchestrate such a scene." "Jealousy," another voice proclaimed with the certainty of revealed wisdom. "Pure jealousy. She pursued the Duke for 2 seasons and was rejected. This was revenge, nothing more. To attack an innocent woman so publicly, the cruelty of it, and to be so thoroughly exposed." The whispers built and layered, creating a chorus of condemnation that surrounded Lady Penelope like a rising tide. She stood where Caspian had left her, her face drained of color, her earlier confidence shattered into fragments that glittered like broken glass at her feet. Women who had been her allies turned away, suddenly finding fascination in their fans or the architecture of the ceiling. Men who had sought her favor now avoided her gaze with the careful deliberation of people distancing themselves from contagion. Social death, Serafina realized. She was witnessing the precise destruction that Lady Penelope had intended for her, now visited upon its architect with perfect, terrible symmetry. She should have felt vindicated, triumphant. Some dark satisfaction at seeing her tormentor brought low. Instead, she felt only a hollow exhaustion and a creeping horror at how quickly these people could turn, how complete their condemnation could be, how little mercy existed in the glittering world they all inhabited. A touch at her elbow made her turn. Caspian stood beside her, and the crowd parted before him as the Red Sea had parted for Moses. He offered his arm with the formal precision of a gentleman requesting a dance, but the look in his eyes held nothing formal about it. "Miss Chase," he said, his voice pitched for her ears alone, despite the dozens straining to hear. "Would you do me the honor of taking some air? I fear the ballroom has become rather stifling." It was an offer of escape, an acknowledgement that she needed respite from the overwhelming assault of sudden social acceptance. But it was also a public declaration, a visible demonstration that the Duke of Rothesay was claiming her under the eyes of the entire ton. Serafina placed her hand on his arm, felt the solid warmth of him beneath the fine fabric of his coat, and allowed him to lead her through the crowd. People stepped aside, bowing and curtsying, offering congratulations and compliments that blurred together into meaningless noise. They passed Lady Penelope, who stood frozen in her disgrace. Caspian did not even glance in her direction. It was a cut more devastating than any words could have been. The absolute erasure of her existence. The removal of her from his awareness as though she were a piece of furniture unworthy of notice. The terrace doors stood open to the night air, and Caspian guided Serafina through them with the careful attention of a man navigating precious cargo through a storm. The moment they crossed the threshold, the noise of the ballroom dimmed, replaced by the softer sounds of evening, the rustle of leaves in the garden below, the distant clip of horses' hooves on cobblestones, the whisper of wind through the ornamental trees. Serafina drew in a breath of cool air and felt something in her chest unclench for the first time since Lady Penelope had launched her attack. They were not alone. Several other couples occupied the terrace, though they maintained a respectful distance. But the illusion of privacy was enough to allow her to finally speak. "You knew," she said, turning to face him. "You knew she would do this." Caspian's expression shifted, something like guilt flickering across his features. "Not the specifics, but I suspected she would make some move. She called upon my steward again 2 days ago, asking pointed questions about my schedule, my social engagements, my connections to your family." He paused, his jaw tightening. "She was gathering intelligence, preparing for an attack. I should have warned you more explicitly, should have taken steps to prevent—" "You could not have prevented it," Serafina interrupted. "If not tonight, then tomorrow or next week." She was determined. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "She was, which is why I took certain precautions." Serafina's brows drew together. "The letter. You brought it with you tonight." "I brought it with me everywhere," Caspian said, a faint smile touching his mouth. "Since the moment I sent a copy to your home, the original has remained on my person. I suspected that if Lady Penelope were to strike, she would demand evidence, would challenge you to produce proof you could not provide without betraying my confidence." His hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. "I could not allow you to face that impossible choice alone. The import of it settled over Serafina like a weight. He had anticipated the trap, had prepared his defense, had armed himself with the very evidence that would vindicate her, and had carried it with him like a talisman, waiting for the moment when it would be needed. "You sacrificed your privacy," she said softly. "The confidential nature of the Harpenden matter. You exposed it all to protect me." "I exposed it to protect the truth," Caspian corrected gently. "And because I realized, standing there watching Lady Penelope attempt to destroy you, that some things matter more than discretion, more than strategy, more than the careful management of reputation." His thumb brushed across her knuckles. "You matter more." The terrace had grown quieter as other couples drifted back into the ballroom, drawn by curiosity about the ongoing drama, or perhaps by the unseasonable chill that had crept into the April air. Caspian seemed to notice the exodus, and with a subtle gesture toward the stone balustrade at the far end of the terrace, he guided Serafina away from the remaining stragglers until they stood in relative privacy beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak. The sounds of the ballroom reached them as distant music now, muffled and dreamlike. Lanterns hung in the garden below cast pools of golden light across manicured paths. But here in the shadows, they were nearly invisible to casual observation. A chaperone might object to such seclusion, but after the evening's public declarations, the rules seemed to have shifted in ways Serafina was still struggling to comprehend. "I need to tell you something," Caspian said, turning to face her fully. In the dim light, his features were all sharp angles and shadows, but his eyes held a warmth that made her heart stutter. "Before we return to that circus of social rehabilitation, before your family descends upon us with questions and expectations, before the machinery of society begins to grind forward with all its inexorable momentum, I need you to understand why I did what I did tonight." Serafina's hand remained on his arm, and she could feel the tension in his muscles despite his outward composure. "You defended me," she said simply. "You produced evidence when I could not." "I did more than that," he said, his voice dropping lower. "I made a public declaration of intent before I had properly sought your father's permission. I exposed confidential business matters to 300 witnesses. I violated every rule of discretion and careful strategy that I have built my reputation upon." He paused, and something that might have been vulnerability flickered across his face. "I did all of this not because it was the tactical choice, not because it served some greater purpose, but because watching Lady Penelope attempt to destroy you made me realize something fundamental." He took her hand properly now, no longer the formal arm-in-arm of a gentleman escorting a lady, but the deliberate clasp of one person reaching for another. His thumb found her pulse point, whether by accident or design, and she wondered if he could feel how her heart raced. "I have spent my entire life managing perceptions," Caspian continued. "My father was a cautionary tale of ducal excess, a man who indulged every whim, ignored every responsibility, and left his estates and tenants to suffer while he pursued pleasure. When I inherited, I was determined to be his opposite. Controlled, strategic. Every action calculated to serve the greater good of my position and the people who depended upon it." The bitterness in his voice spoke of years of careful self-discipline, of a young man who had sacrificed spontaneity and joy on the altar of duty. "And then I met you," he said, and the bitterness transformed into something softer. "You, who chose truth over expedience in Lady Morrison's drawing room, even knowing it would cost you. You, who refused to betray my confidence tonight, even when doing so would have saved you from humiliation. You, who possess an integrity so fundamental that you cannot even comprehend compromising it for advantage. Serafina felt heat rise in her cheeks. I am not so noble as you make me sound. I was terrified. Her voice caught. I nearly believed you would abandon me when you remained silent. I know, Caspian said quietly. I saw it in your eyes. That moment when you thought I was calculating whether you were worth the scandal. His hand tightened on hers. I will regret causing you that pain for the rest of my life. But I needed to hear Lady Penelope's accusations in full. Needed to let her construct her trap completely, so that when I dismantled it, there could be no question, no lingering doubt about your honesty. The strategic mind that had managed estates and negotiated with earls, Serafina realized, had been at work even in those terrible moments of silence. He had not been weighing whether to defend her, but how to defend her most effectively. You handled yourself with a grace I could not have managed, he continued. You stood there while they condemned you, while I remained silent. And you never once lashed out, never once attempted to save yourself at my expense. You chose honor over self-preservation, integrity over expedience. His free hand rose to cup her cheek, the touch gentle despite the calluses she could feel against her skin. That is not common, Serafina. That is extraordinary. And it is precisely why I cannot imagine facing the future without you beside me. Her breath caught at the intimacy of her given name on his lips, at the declaration implicit in his words. I know I should wait, Caspian said. And now there was something almost rueful in his expression. I should call upon your father tomorrow with proper formality. Should allow you time to recover from this evening's ordeal before pressing you for an answer to a question I have not yet properly asked. But I find I cannot wait. I have never been good at patience when something matters. And you? He stopped, seeming to search for words adequate to the moment. You matter more than anything else in my carefully ordered life. He took a breath, and Serafina realized with a start that he was nervous. The Duke of Rothesay, who had faced down a ballroom of hostile nobility without a flicker of uncertainty, was nervous about asking a question to which he could not be certain of the answer. Serafina Chase, he said, formal despite the intimacy of their positioning, despite the way his hand still cradled her face. I am asking you, not as a duke to a prospective duchess, not as a matter of strategic alliance or social advantage, but as a man who has found in you something he did not know he was missing. Will you marry me? Will you stand beside me? Counsel me when I am wrong? Challenge me when I am stubborn? And share the burdens that come with a position neither of us asked for, but both must navigate? It was not the pretty proposal of novels, all poetry and romantic declarations. It was honest and direct and utterly characteristic of the man before her. A man who had stripped away pretense to offer her a true partnership rather than a gilded cage. Yes, Serafina said, the word emerging with a certainty that surprised her. After the chaos of the evening, after the terror and humiliation and dizzying reversal, this was the first thing that felt unequivocally right. Yes, I will marry you. The smile that transformed Caspian's face was worth every moment of the evening's ordeal. It was unguarded and genuine, the expression of a man who had hoped but not dared to assume. And it made him look younger, less burdened by the weight of ducal responsibility. He kissed her then, there on the darkened terrace with the sounds of the ballroom drifting around them and the spring night cool on their skin. It was brief and chaste, proper enough not to compromise her further, but intimate enough to seal the promise they had just made to each other. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright with something that might have been joy or relief, or both. "I will call upon your father first thing tomorrow morning," he said. "With your permission, I would like to have the banns read as soon as possible. I find I am not inclined to a long engagement." Serafina laughed, a sound of pure happiness that felt foreign after the evening's trauma. "Society will talk." "Society is already talking," Caspian pointed out, amusement coloring his voice. "After tonight's performance, we might as well give them something genuine to discuss." They returned to the ballroom together. And if anyone noticed that Serafina's color was high and the Duke wore an expression of uncharacteristic satisfaction, discretion prevented comment. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and barely concealed envy. Of matrons who suddenly remembered long-standing connections to the Chase family and gentlemen who discovered urgent reasons to discuss business with the Duke. Lady Penelope had vanished at some point, spirited away by her mortified family to begin the long process of social rehabilitation that might or might not ever restore her to acceptable standing. Serafina found she could not muster much sympathy, though neither did she take pleasure in the woman's downfall. It simply was. A consequence as inevitable as sunrise following the machinations of the evening. 3 months later, on a golden morning in July, Serafina walked down the aisle of St. George's, Hanover Square on her father's arm, toward a future she had not dared to imagine that terrible night in April. The church was packed with nobility who had come to witness the elevation of an insignificant girl from Bloomsbury to the position of Duchess of Rothesay. But Serafina barely noticed them. Her attention fixed on Caspian, who waited at the altar with an expression of such open devotion that several ladies in the front pews were moved to tears. When she reached him and placed her hand in his, she felt the same certainty that had filled her on the terrace. The bone-deep knowledge that this was right, that this man who valued truth and honor above social advantage was exactly who she wanted beside her for whatever came next. The ceremony concluded, and as they emerged from the church into the brilliant summer sunlight, the crowd that had gathered erupted in cheers. Not polite applause, but genuine celebration for a love story that had captured the imagination of a society starved for authentic romance among its endless strategic marriages. Caspian handed her into the carriage bearing the Rothesay crest, and as they pulled away from the church toward the wedding breakfast, he took her hand and raised it to his lips. "Your Grace," he said, humor and warmth and promise coloring the formal address. Serafina, Duchess of Rothesay, smiled at her husband and knew with absolute certainty that she was not just loved, but irrevocably, publicly, and eternally honored by a man who had chosen her truth over convenient fiction, her integrity over easy alliance. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and she had no illusions that the life of a duchess would be simple. They would face them together. Two people who had found in each other not just love, but the rarest of all treasures in their glittering world. A true partnership built on mutual respect and unwavering trust. The Ton would talk about this wedding for years to come, she knew. But they would speak not just of the scandal that preceded it, but of the devotion that followed. A duke and his duchess who had chosen each other not for advantage, but for love, and who had paid for that choice with courage, truth, and an unshakable commitment to honor above all else. My lovely family, if you felt anything during this story, if your heart raced when she was accused, if you held your breath when he stayed silent, if you got chills when he read that letter, if you smiled at their wedding, then I'm begging you, don't just walk away satisfied. Share this video. Send it to that friend who's going through something hard. Send it to your sister who needs to remember that integrity wins. Send it to anyone who's ever been called a liar when they were telling the truth. Because here's what breaks my heart. I spend hours crafting these stories, pouring real emotion into every word. And most of you will feel everything you just felt, and then do nothing. You'll let this moment fade. You won't subscribe. You won't share it. Won't save it. Won't help it reach the people who desperately need to hear that honor still matters. Don't let this be just another video you scroll past and forget. Subscribe so you never miss when truth defeats malice. Like if you believe integrity should be rewarded. And share this if you think someone in your life needs to see what real devotion looks like. Please. These stories matter too much to disappear into the algorithm. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.